Hi, yes, I'm Bernie Hogan. I'm a research fellow here at the OII. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Ben. A little known fact about my career is this book, Leonardo's Laptop by Ben Shneiderman. My first publication was a book review of this many years ago. So I went back and reviewed it to kind of come up with some gem, and it's all just really tepid and safe, like a graduate student. I think Barry, my supervisor, told me he's a big deal, so you should you think about that when you're doing your review. But it was
now we could be more scathing, right?
So now it's time to years later let the gloves off, and I've had a review of it, and I got to tell you, I was a precocious student. If you read the annotations in the marginalia here, I was actually like, oh, this is silly and this is foolish, because I didn't have the wisdom then that I've somewhat tapped into now, and or fear. But no, pregnant in this and in a lot of Ben's work is a very humanist approach to computing. There's a feeling, and it's in here, it's in the new one, it's in his other work. Most near and dear to my heart would be this one right here on NodeXL, something I was also a collaborator in, is this notion that if you give people better design, you give people better tools, they can do better work. It sounds so simple, however, it is in some sense a little under siege. There's opportunity costs for that, and one of those is, how about we find ways to replace humans or optimize things away from humans? And that kind of reduces the imagination. And in my work, and in a lot of work here at the OII, we're very interested in this sort of the social science questions. We're interested in the human element of technology. So having one of the fathers of human-computer interaction and someone who's got an absolute laundry list of amazing innovations, from hypertext links to treemaps to all sorts of other stuff that was already said at the previous talk, which you should have been at. I think it should be no question that it's such a great speaker to stimulate our imaginations, our ideas about human-computer interaction and the internet.
That was a very kind introduction. Thank you. And it's not Bernie, but it's clever Bernie. Somehow, I feel like always when I talk about Bernie and his work, it's always worth saying clever next to it. So thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Taha, for arranging, and thank you all for making me warmly received here over this 5-day visit, and Nigel Shadbolt especially. Last night, an elegant dinner and a charming evening. So I'm very pleased to be here. I come from this group at University of Maryland, the Human-Computer Interaction Lab, which is now in 7th director. And the collaboration between computer science and the iSchool is this enduring group. But there's many other partnerships around campus, including the wonderfully titled Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, MITH. And the website has 800 technical reports and 200 videos and lots of other things that you may find relevant to the issues here. This is actually my 3rd visit to the OII. I think the first one I was speaking about the Leonardo's laptop. So that was a very satisfying exploration for me. And I appreciate Bernie citing my sort of broader than usual outlook on life, but especially I like the phrasing that design shapes and is a gift to users because it enables them, it empowers them to be creative and so on. So the notion and devotion to design is relevant to this talk, as you'll see. And the book Designing the User Interface began in 1986, and now its 6th edition requires 6 authors to tell the story of the remarkable growth of HCI and the fact that 8 billion people have something like this in their pockets and they can use it, whether they're young or old, novice or experts, or disabilities or low literacy. They still can do the things they need to build relationships within their family, to carry out business, to get medical advice, to get education, and so on. So it's been a transformative world, and rather satisfying and remarkable in my lifetime to see these changes. So this is sort of one starting point. I mean, it's worth saying that my background was in physics and particle physics. I worked at Brookhaven Laboratories and was from that direction. My computer science background was traditional database and optimization algorithms and indexing strategies. And I moved to being 20% of an experimental psychologist, I'd say. And so the new methodologies of psychology were of interest to me. And I'm a member of the National Academy of Engineering. So that's sort of another world, and yet the book is called Designing the User Interface. So these are the themes that sort of lead in for those who want to do the psychohistory of how I got to be where I, standing today. And I'm talking today about the book Designing, the New ABCs of Research. So Bernie mentioned, some of the things we did was the idea of a highlighted link, a light blue color still used here to highlight in the paragraph these words. And that was our work in 1984, 85. Tim Berners-Lee cited that in his Spring 89 Manifesto for the Web. And we had developed the first electronic book that was in the Library of Congress and developed on a single PC. Tim's brilliant breakout was to say we can connect across all these machines in a networked way, and that was a profound step forward. But the idea that you can click on these things, and the way to do that was our work. Also, these touchscreen keyboards, when we were beginning to work in 87, 88, the guidance was to have buttons that were an inch square. So we made a 9-inch wide keyboard. We made a 7-inch and a 5-inch and a 3-inch one. And we made it possible by putting your finger down, a cursor would appear above it, and you could slide it around and activate on liftoff. So the liftoff paper was the Chi 88 conference, and that became the way Apple developed it. I was a consultant to Apple and had connections with them. Steve Jobs visited our lab. And these connections with real-world people, real-world problems is the essential ingredient, I think. Maybe that's too strong. The promising ingredient, not essential, but often the positive thing, that working on real problems with real users and real data is the story I'm telling. I'm a photographer and had some 40,000 photos on my laptop, and finding the ones I wanted was always a challenge. So we built Photo Finder around 2000, 2001, and you could have the names of people, and you could drag them on here, and they would click and drop in. And I got a patent for that, which subsequently was sold by the University of Maryland, and there are 57 other patents that cite that work. So sometimes you get to see the traces of how these little ideas, and each of these are seemed modest at the time, but sometimes little design ideas which empower people in strong ways have powerful outcomes. And I'll just say briefly, my main work has been a lot of visualization and development of Spotfire and its commercial success for pharmaceutical drug discovery and genomic data, chemical, and so on. And the treemaps here showing a commercial version called FIN, or financial visualization. These are the technology stocks. These are the banking stocks and software, and you have these different industries and the utilities here. So you can see it's a pretty good day. Green means stocks are going up. And the area indicates the market capitalization. Apple is the biggest one, and Google and Facebook and Microsoft and ExxonMobil, Johnson & Johnson. If you didn't know, you now know it, and you see it, and it's memorable, and it's visible. And you can see the red spots interspersed, which remind you that even on good days, some companies have bad days. And even on the good days, some industries like utilities are generally red. But even within that, there's some green dots. So the capacity to see these high-level patterns, particulars at the intermediate scale, and then specifics is one of the virtues. And you're looking at 500 stocks here in the Standard & Poor's 500, and that's a lot of rows of a spreadsheet which would just not be browsable, and no convenient algorithm would show you all those insights that I enumerated to you. So it takes a little training to learn how that's done. NodeXL, which Bernie had a role in, but Mark Smith has been the key person. This was one of our early efforts to show the polarization in voting in the U.S. Senate. Red Republicans are very tight together, the blue Democrats tight together. 2 independents are there, and 3 Republicans who occasionally would cross over and vote with the Democrats. And that was very revealing and an important step forward. And 2 hours ago, I spoke about event flow for electronic medical histories and other temporal sequences. So I'm trying to make the point that these design problems were really a useful stimulus, and these were all pushed forward by real problems from real users and refined through the development in partnership with practitioners. Spotfire became a commercial success story, and many other visualization tools. I guess I'll just breeze through. That's kind of the argument for visualization, and just come to the subject for today. So I think that's just give you a little bit of perspective of where I'm coming from. Because the message I have today that's in this book is a difficult and powerful one, and I hope to leave you, I hope you'll leave actually with a stronger sense that the current models of thinking about how research should be done it's time for them to be revised and updated because the situation has changed. So this book is meant as a guide for junior researchers, but also a manifesto for change. So it has these two different audiences. And the new ABCs is a bit of a joke, but achieving breakthrough collaborations is one of the ABCs. And another, and the key one, is applied and basic combined. We'll focus on that. That if you work on applied problems with practitioners and take a theoretical approach, you're more likely to have the twin win. The twin win of successful breakthrough papers published that have generalizable results and validated solutions which can be disseminated for specific applications. That's the goal. We're after the twin win. So that's where we're going. And just to look back at how I came to this, I was trained in an era that was greatly influenced by the writings of Vannevar Bush. Some of you are nodding in recognition. He was, Memex was he was sort of the visionary of the web, if you will. He wrote an article about that. But he wrote, in 1945, as World War II was coming to an end, he wrote a manifesto about science after the war, and it's called Science, the Endless Frontier, a wonderfully titled article that's still heavily cited and used as a guide to science policy and science construction, let's say, and maybe more broadly, research construction, okay? And in this book, Vannevar Bush suggests that the way to do research is you start with basic research, pure research he called it also, and then you do your applied research, and then you seek to develop products, and then you go to market. And this linear model, as it came to be known, is simple, it's compelling, it's clear. Unfortunately, it rarely works. That's the pitch. And others have called it a beautiful lie, because they believe that Vannevar Bush knew that it was a lie even then, that it wasn't true even then. Because if you read the alternate chapters of his book, he celebrates how medical research advanced tremendously during World War II because of the challenge of tropical diseases, new kinds of wounds, new kinds of information. And he seems to celebrate that idea of working on real problems, but then he intersperses it with his devotion to basic and pure research, which he says inevitably lead to applied research and benefits to society. And this idea remains strong. On March 21st, in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Committee on Research, on Science, the Subcommittee on Research of the House Science Committee, held a meeting to discuss research strategies. And 3 of the 4 speakers, one of them, Nigel, you'll be glad to know, was talking about open data, but it was quite separate. The other 3 returned to citing Vannevar Bush and that we should be supporting basic research. Even now, there's a 50-year history of evidence and people advocating against this. Early on, Tom Allen, MIT professor, had claimed this doesn't really work and suggested maybe a reverse linear, that if you work on problems and you trace back, you get to basic. That wasn't quite right either. Klein and others proposed other models. In 1997, Donald Stokes' famous book called Pasteur's Quadrant now begin to frame the story in a way that we hoped would stick. And Pasteur's Quadrant was devoted to working on real problems while taking a theoretical approach. And so he called that use-inspired basic research. Not a bad term, not a bad term. And Pasteur was the poster child for this vision because Pasteur worked with the milk farmers whose milk was going bad and with the vintners whose wine was turning to vinegar. And what do you know? He gets the basic research breakthrough of germs, the germ theory of disease. And he fixes the milk with pasteurization and he fixes the wine industry by giving them the right procedures that would avoid the vinegar. Pretty good, and he gets vaccination for diseases. There was a pretty heavy turnout of basic research and really powerful application. That's why it's so much appreciated. Now, Stokes was clever enough to say there is also Niels Bohr's quadrant, which is pure research and has value, and there's the Thomas Edison quadrant, which is applied. Thomas Edison had 160 patents, but not too many papers. He was turning out one device after another, and he might have done even better had he known a little science or he had partnered. But he was out there churning out, commercial products in a remarkable way. So there's room to go other ways, but the point of this book says that if you as a student or a researcher are interested in having higher impact, your chances will grow if you do both. Not one or the other, not one first, but do both. Applied and basic combined. So that's where we're going with this story. And I claim that there's 3 reasons we need to go this direction. The first is the problems of our time are vastly different from they were in 1945 or even before, when science was research. That's all there was. Science was research. Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, made science the equivalent of research. And the reductionist thinking and the laboratory studies of science are still valuable. We'll stick with them. But in the last 50 years, we've opened the doors to other ways of doing research and other ways of thinking about research. So that's the story. The immense problems are healthcare delivery, environmental preservation, energy sustainability, cybersecurity, community safety. There's a large set of problems that people agree are the grand challenges of our time. Read the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. Read the Bill and Melinda Gates grand challenges. Read the National Academy of Engineering's 15 grand challenges. Each of these, if you look at them, have a larger frame. It's not just a matter of a narrowly constrained problem, but it's a social dimension, a socio-technical system. And so these depend heavily on context, and therefore the reductionist model in the laboratory study is no longer sufficient. It's useful, but no longer sufficient. So that's the first. The problems have changed. The second, the good news is we have very much more powerful technologies, especially the web. Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, and team. That the web produced a remarkable change in that when my students and I are working on a problem and we have an idea, in 3 hours, we've read the top 10 papers, we know who the leaders are, we send them an email and we say, what do you think of this? And we get an answer. So the capacity to get the previous history, to find collaborators, to try new ideas, to publish partial results, to get feedback, and then disseminate final results is remarkably changed. And the way researchers work is also different. 45 years ago, researchers read, on average, 175 papers a year, usually from 6 or 8 journals in paper that they subscribe to. Okay? And now they read about 350 or 400 papers a year, which come electronically to them, often recommended by friends, by Twitter, by YouTube, by blogs, and they read much more broadly than they used to. And they have many more different references. So the subscription model has died out, and we have a broader way of thinking, and that empowers people yet again to deal with more complex issues. Now, the technologies we'll mention briefly, but the collaboration technologies that the web brought of sharing data, sharing documents and working together, Skype and so on, have enabled the collaborations to actually become richer and more powerful. And there's very nice evidence of this, is that 50 years ago, teams did produce higher impact articles, okay? 50 years ago, 50% of articles were written by individuals still. Now, only 10% of papers are written by individuals. 90% of science and engineering papers are teamwork. Okay? And there's a specific kind of teamwork that I want to make sure you understand. It's not just interdisciplinary, which is the common phrase, but get a more nuanced understanding of what kind of teamwork will be more successful. And so what happens now is teamwork 50 years ago did have higher impact, but teamwork now has twice as much impact as it did then. It's kind of interesting. People have learned how to do teamwork. It was hard to do teamwork 50 years ago. Now it's gotten easier. In 1965, the most number of authors for an astronomy paper was 6. We laugh, right? Because now there are 1,000 author papers in a few fields, like astronomy, like physics, like biology. There are, a small number of those, but it's still, the game has changed, the number of authors, and the capacity to work together is improved. The third change is the raised ambition of researchers. I see it in the young people I talk to. A little hard to prove this one, but I see that people do want to make a difference. They do want to be actively engaged. They want to produce results that matter in all those traditional ways. And so what I see that is more measurable is that 30 years ago, a paper in a medical journal might have been a study of 800 patients at a university hospital in a trial. Now it's 10 studies of 800 at 10 universities around the world in very different contexts that show that these methods work everywhere or work under different conditions or specify how those things have changed. So these collaborations have become facilitated and you get much, I think, more ambitious papers. Now, there's a downside because expectations have been raised by the funding agencies as well, and what's publishable now I see as considerably more demanding than what was publishable then. Okay, so as I was working on this book for several years, I was looking for some way to summarize and pull together what were the guiding principles, and there are 2. The first one I've already suggested. It's applied and basic combined, ABC. And that the argument is combining applied and basic research produces more rapid progress in both. Okay, I need to stress that because sometimes people hear me as saying, give up basic and go to applied, or do one, then the other. The idea is to do both. Now, doing both is hard, and it's sometimes hard for one person to be doing it, and that's why there's further impetus to work on teams. Okay? Now, the particular kind of teams, you could probably figure this out, but if you had an applied person and a basic person together, that might be a good team. Now, I'll stretch that a little further. If you have somebody with a problem and somebody with a solution, if they get together, it's probably a good thing. Okay? And fruitfully, the National Science Foundation and others have come to recognize this. If you look at the program called Algorithms in the Field, AITF, it specifies that proposals should come from a computer science algorithms expert working with a domain expert with a particular problem. So they got it. I did speak at the NSF in September, and about 50 program managers were there, and I see more and more of the NSF moving. It's not just me who's saying this, but I think they got these ideas, but I hope I strengthen that. And so the data science hubs are another manifestation of working together with practitioners, spreading out around the countryside. And other recent programs begin to make a clearer statement about a person with a problem and a person with a solution. So this could be interdisciplinary on campus, and in fact, in my second slide, I said that we often work with partners around campus. So we've worked with political scientists and biologists and English researchers who have a problem. So it looks like it's interdisciplinary, but it's more than just interdisciplinary. It's not, you don't get a success story by putting a computer science professor and a dance choreographer together and say, go work, here's 100,000 pounds. It doesn't quite work. You have to come to it with intentionality and with purpose and a problem. So having a problem is a good starting point. Okay, ABC is where we're going. That's principle 1. The second one, I've already also hinted that if you blend the methods of science, engineering, and design, you're likely to have higher impact research, okay? So the scientific method that I was trained in still serves well under certain conditions. However, it does not serve well in a lot of cases. The engineering method of setting requirements, developing measures, starting with a prototype, scaling up, having modular design, these are all good principles of good engineering, okay? And then measuring and improving your metrics over time. That's kind of the engineering method. And the design thinking method is sort of the newer kid on the block and requires maybe a little more explanation, but The designers pride themselves with the idea of divergent thinking at the early stages, who first question the goal that's been put to them. Okay, that's a rather bold thing. Say, well, maybe you don't really want to do it that way. You want to think differently. You want to try different ideas. You want to engage, often the word empathically, with the stakeholders, with the diverse stakeholders. And you want to talk to the real users and the real people. Okay? Get the divergent thinking, get multiple potential solutions, and then converge. And then you have now defined what your goal is. You now go again, divergent thinking about how to carry out the goal, and converge again. The British Design Council calls this the double diamond approach. And I use that in the book. It's a very nice idea and describes what I see happening, what happened in our work, that is reaching out to people with a real problem, trying different ideas early on with low investment. Something small soon is my phrase. Let's try something, let's try 3 or 4 ideas, and then let's see what we're going to really spend our time on. And you know, many have studied the design process. Cynthia Altman at University of Washington, maybe best, for showing that expert designers carry that out. They propose lots of ideas in the beginning, and then it takes them a while till they decide what they're going to do, but once they decide, they make it happen. Whereas novices tend to come up with 1 or 2 ideas, they choose something early on, they start working, and then they find, didn't work, and they have to backtrack and do something else. And so it's kind of a messier process than the more experienced designer. So there's good evidence about this, and I try in the book to give as much evidence for the case that I'm making as possible. So design thinking is a new direction. Maybe the way to characterize it, in the US, the National Academy of Sciences began in 1862. Abraham Lincoln, the only president to hold a patent, starts the National Academy of Sciences, okay? The National Academy of Engineering begins in 1964, 102 years later. The National Academy of Design begins, that's a trick question. There is no National Academy of Design. But I, in the book, suggest by 2066, we should think of having a National Academy of Design in the US. Now, here you have the Royal Academy. It goes back, of course, to Newton and in 1660s, right? Does that sound right to you? And what's that?
I'm an import
and there is the engineering, what's it called? Excuse me, but there are prize for engineering, and design is also well respected in Britain, more than I think in the U.S., which is pretty admirable. So I would say we should be teaching our students all these methods, that we should give them experience in how they do it, and when we're developing projects, we should consider how we combine these. The book has 14 case studies of individuals, organizations, or larger groups that have followed this kind of idea, like Bell Laboratories, okay? And there again, you have, what I saw was the revisionist history that Vannevar Bush and others had promoted, that basic research leads to application. So they say, the transistor. Look at that. Isn't that a great... Well, Bardeen, Shockley, and Brattain in 1947 were looking to solve a real problem, that vacuum tubes were too hot and inefficient, and they needed a solution. So it was a real problem. And they, in fact, invented the transistor. And only 6 months later did they discover the transistor effect, for which they get the Nobel Prize in physics. And so the celebration around that, and you'll read many of the histories will tell about how they worked on the basic research and then came this application. And it's just not true. Similarly, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson were working for Bell Labs to make microwave communications possible. And there was this kind of noisy signal, and whatever they did, they could not reduce this background noise. And they discovered the background cosmic radiation from the Big Bang. Pretty good, for which they get a Nobel Prize in physics. And one version of history says, you see, basic research led to this microwave communications, okay? And yet, so this, you might want to read, these stories in part come from a charming guy named Venkatesh Narayana Murthy. He worked at Bell Labs for 20 years, went to Harvard and was Dean of Engineering, for many years. He's now emeritus. He's a 78-year-old, cheerful, energetic guy who you just can't help but like. And he came out with a book with this similar principle to mine called Cycles of Discovery and Invention. And he also condemns Vannevar Bush and tells a lot more detail of the history and talks about how these things often go together. Okay, so you know there's a lot of invested in this idea. Okay, so here's where we are. Oh, not quite. The idea that design was so important was a bit troubling to me because that wasn't where I was trained, and I began to look for the evidence there. This is a spurious. I guess that's the echo of this screen. Whoops! How interesting. There's this projector. There we go. There's the echo of that black line. It's still there. Okay, anyway, the Google Ngram viewer lets you search 20 million books over the last few hundred years, and I show you 1900 to 2000. Yeah, you want to turn it off? Give it 10 seconds.
Give it 10 seconds?
Yeah, it takes a little to... It's okay. No, bring it back. It's all right. Not so bad. We'll get used to it. Okay, so, during the 20th century, the word science wiggles along over here. The word engineering wiggles along over here. But design wiggles along and then in 1975 crosses over. That was kind of interesting, a surprise to me. I didn't know to expect that. I was uncertain about how important that was. It's one data point. I was a little doubtful. But then while writing the book, the New York Times labs put out their Chronicle system, which lets you search the times for all these things. And they did a similar thing. And so engineer wiggles along during the 20th century, scientist wiggles along, and designer goes in 1975, crosses over to be the dominant topic. Well, 2 data points was a lot stronger, and those figures are both in the book. So you can take a look at those and question or challenge them. But it was a part of the growing awareness. So Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive were part of that. They didn't create it, but they were part of that movement to show that design is important. If you read the Harvard Business Review or lots of other sources, design is rising and growing and seen as a vital business force. But I just want to make clear to you that design is more than a way of making a nice poster or a beautiful device. Design is a way of gathering, discovering new knowledge about the world. That's the radical thing to say, that like science, like engineering, it's not just about building things, but it's about knowledge of the world. It's about research. And while science used to be the only form of research, engineering became accepted as research, and now I'm advocating that design be accepted as research. I think we have a ways to go, but I think that's the trajectory that I want to encourage you. So here again, as implications for the way we train our students, the way we organize our curricula. Some universities, like Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, have put in strong design programs. And classically, RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, and SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design, and OCAD in Canada, and others have moved down this road earlier, and it's a growing trend. Okay, in the book I cite many examples of where the design thinking is helpful. Okay, so here's where we are. We've got some new contexts and problems. I say there's a couple of key principles which require some changes of thinking and may be unsettling to some of you, and the implications may still unwind in your minds as you think about this over time. But then the book goes quite specifically to try to take a look at how we now put this to work. So the first part of this says, choose actionable problems by working with civic, business, or global partners or priorities. Okay? And the partners you want to work with, you want to be closely with civic partners, city, county, or national or international. You want to work with businesses as another good source. And you may also want to work with global partnerships, and maybe on your campus is another place. So there's places where you'll find people with problems. And in studying the way users or researchers, young researchers, choose problems, there's very little advice. Peter Medawar, British biologist, Nobel Prize winner, in his book, Advice to a Young Scientist, makes this cute phrase about, don't choose piffling problems, and that's often quoted. And it's a kind of sweet line, but I could not find more clear descriptions about how people should choose. It's kind of hot here, and maybe the door could be open, a little breeze. What's that?
Turn on the AC.
All right, maybe. I'm hot, and I assume you are too. So anyway, the idea of how to choose problems, we now have, there are more frequently, you'll see science roadmaps, you'll see grand challenge websites. Increasingly, that's a way, and that's taking a look at then might be useful. Furthermore, kind of fun to look at innocentive.com. Any innocentive solvers here? Not you, Bernie? Innocentive's a company, and they invite companies, other companies, to post problems with $20,000 or $50,000 awards for solution, as 60 days or 90 days on it. And there's 500,000 people, including me, who have signed up as a solver, and we get to see those problems. And so it's a way of tapping in pretty quickly to understanding of which problems are currently really care about enough that someone's putting some dollars behind it.
We were doing the Fragile Families Challenge here with the Turing Institute. Matt Selganic talked about similar stuff as this as well. It's
Yeah.
like large-scale collaborative social science. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah. It's sort of
Well, that goes-
interesting ways that more than ever you can look at these things. Also, I get my students to read the NSF programs. What are the things that the collective wisdom of NSF and the community have decided are key problems of our time? So we have ways to give students a chance to immerse themselves in the current problems. And if they immerse themselves in current problems, it turns out there's more funding, people care about it, and if you do something, you might have some positive outcomes, you might start a company, you might, produce some changes. And so I think those are valuable things, and we should open the doorways to our students to let them know there are these ways of getting ideas for their work, okay? Most students begin by working with their mentor, or professor, or advisor, and just follow on what's been given to them. But I think we all can have wider ways of choosing problems. Okay. Then the way we're going to plan our work, this says apply, observation, intervention, and controlled experiments. So observation and controlled experiments are maybe the traditional ways, Darwinian observation and controlled experiments of the scientific method, but the current possibility is mind expanding. You can actually try things out at scale. You can intervene in real systems. Kurt Lewin, the social psychologist, wrote, if you want to understand something, try to change it. Okay? If you want to understand how social networks, so communities work, how citizen science becomes effective, try to do something there. If you want to stop bullying on the internet, don't just study bullying, don't just understand it, but actually try to stop it. And once you get out there, and this is what industry's adopted, the so-called A/B testing method, where you can put out, Amazon will put out a website with its normal book information, another one where the book picture is bigger. And does a bigger book picture sell more books? Well, in a few days, you get tens of thousands of people on one version, tens of thousands on the other, and you get some data. Maybe imperfect, but that's the idea of doing intervention. So the aspiration, the ambition I want to raise is that my students should be able to produce beneficial social change during their work, not after, when it's published or when they're graduate, but during their work, even the undergraduates. And so my students wind up talking to companies. I bring speakers in from companies, and they make partnerships, and they have a real client, a real user to build something. And the goal is to build something that benefits somebody outside the classroom and survives beyond the semester. Okay? So there are little ways you can make big interventions in your own teaching and your own work to get closer to the reality, and I think have bigger breakthroughs. Okay? Next is about forming teams. This is the largest chapter and has the most references. It's become a very hot topic, but forming teams is a good idea, but there are good and bad ways to form a team, and there are good and bad ways to manage a team. Last year's publication from the National Academies called Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. Say it again, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. Worth looking at. It's free to download, the whole book. And it's a very well written book that describes the fundamental, the research as well as the practice about how to do it. And, you know, it should have been told enhancing the effectiveness of team research, but they were focused on science, and so that's the way it stuck. And it's a good book that tells some of these stories about small teams of 1 to 10, and then larger teams of 10 to 100, and then massive teams of hundreds to thousands. And understanding the social dynamics of how these work and how to make them succeed is non-trivial. I mean, if we have more time, we could go into that, but I think that's kind of really the compelling thing. And the evidence is quite strong again, I'll repeat, that these the right kinds of partnerships produce higher benefits. So while I was working on this, struggling to find the evidence, I got a little gift of the following. I attended the KDD, Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining Conference, a very strong, very competitive conference. Acceptance rate's 14% for this conference. They had, let's see, what was it? They had 140 papers accepted, right, so they had more than 1,000 submitted, and they chose 140. It was a pretty tough, you know, high-quality conference. And Jury Leskovich, some of you may know, a brilliant, wonderful guy at Stanford now, but he's really a clever, clever guy. Like you, Bernie.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
he's way more clever. And he looks younger.
Anyway, but Bernie, Jury's a very interesting guy, and he did the analysis of those papers and the reviews that were done by the reviewers, and it was, as I say, a sweet little gift for me, because the papers that were authored by teams of academics and industry people had statistically significantly higher ratings than those that were just industry or just academic. It was really sweet. Now, you can't base a whole theory on that, but since then I've gotten further evidence and confirmation of other ways that that's happening. In the US, there's a strong movement, and I suspect here also. I saw the construction of the H.C. Allen building, collaboration spaces, and it uses a lot of this language on Banbury Street further up here. So I see there's, you know, these things, in the UK innovation efforts are suggesting these things. But the ways of doing it right and wrong are really important. In the US, I'm attached with and now supporting my effort is the National Academies has a group called Government University Industry Research Roundtable that meets twice a year to discuss that. And then 10 years ago, they spun off a group with the equally awkward name of UIDP, University Industry Demonstration Partnerships. But the uidp.org website has really nice information and a good 30-page manual with templates of how universities should work with industry, how agreements should be done about sharing data, how to decide about intellectual property ownership, how to deal with corporate privacy or corporate secret information. So there's a lot of issues. It's not trivial, but more and more universities are moving down that road, okay? And the partnerships with industry and partnerships with civic government, I like to cite in one of my 14 case studies is Citrus in California. Information technology, research and support in service of the state, something, Citrus, okay, Citrus. And it's $200 million to 4 universities in the state California system. I think it's Berkeley, Merced, Santa Barbara, and Davis. And they are working on problems of concern to the state. And it's produced really nice results that I think are a good model. That's one model of a government-supported one, but there are many corporate partnerships that are growing as exemplars. Okay, so the team formation and then the team management are other issues. And then, you know, once you start with the data, there's, you know, testing ideas and prototypes with realistic interventions. And here I make the pitch about big data. I mean, never before, or for the first time in history, let's say, we have remarkable collection of data that so much of what we do is online. And to me, this is a real gift. You know, the big data literature is often I'm sort of amused about. It's the flood. We're drowning in data. The tsunami. The flood of data. But for me, it's the sweet waters of irrigation that will nurture our creative thinking. You know, let's get on with it. You know, this is what we want. And the visualization tools I talked about this a couple of hours ago, I think, are part of the path towards making that really happen. So, but the balance of this big data with qualitative data is the essential part. And, you know, we see these things where big data analysis It's very sweet. You crank in, and you crank the data in, and out comes a model. It's predictive, it's correlative, and we don't have causality, but hey, it works, and so on for a while. Like the Google flu trends, which was such a bold idea, but it failed so badly after a while that Google removed it from the website, and all we have left is David Lazer's excellent retrospective post-mortem of why it failed. And so it's worth taking a look at. So I'm a great fan of mixed methods, of balancing appropriate moments of qualitative case study data. I was very moved forward in my thinking by Richard Ye's book about the case study method in social science research, where he made the claim that was startling to me, trained in the scientific method, which was that repeated case studies would collect evidence in support of a hypothesis. Pretty nice. There was no p-values or t-tests, but it was a way of saying if you work with 10 disaster response teams and you hear about the aspects of their success, you have a working theory about what made for success and failure. And those rich, thick descriptions are important. Okay, so the last part is how do you promote adoption and then assess the impact of this work in these new environments. So promoting adoption is maybe one of the more fun parts of the book, but I began to see that, the evidence that actually you do have to get out there and promote your work. My colleagues, some of them say, my research speaks for itself. I don't want to tweet about it. I don't want to post about it. I don't want to make a video. I don't want to blog. I'm not there because my work speaks for itself. Now, that may have been true, I'm not sure, in the past, but now there are 2 million refereed papers published per year in the index literature, okay? And that continues to grow. And in that environment, you better be out there talking about it. Now, you don't have to go wild and talk about it and have balloons or other things. But if you talk about it at your colleagues' locations, if you go and visit the leaders of the field, if you talk to others working, make presentations like I'm doing here, I've come to see, that's a valuable way of promoting your idea and gaining feedback. Your questions and challenges are part of what I learn from. And I've done about 25 talks about this book over the last year and a half in the US, Canada, and UK. And it's fascinating to me to see where the pushbacks come, and I've refined my model and begun to develop ways to promote this. So promoting adoption's one challenge. Maybe there's this sweet story. It's just 2 paragraphs in the book, a short section, but it gives you an idea of the fresher way of thinking, the opportunity, and the way it responds to what students are asking for. So it's called Send, Five, and Thrive. Send, Five, and Thrive. And this was triggered by working with a grad student of mine. We finished the paper, it was reviewed, and it was accepted for publication. We had 2 weeks in which to make the final revisions and submit the final version. And I said to the student, go to the paper, and we have about 60 references. Look them over and choose the 5 people who are the most significant workers in this area, that we've referenced them, we build on their work. Get their email addresses and send them a note. Dear superstar professor, I'm a PhD student working at the University of Maryland with Ben Shneiderman. He sends his regards. We are about to submit a paper for final publication in 2 weeks that builds on your work, and we have 2 questions for you. 1, have we been fair in describing your contribution? And 2, have you written anything recently that we should be citing in this paper?
Have we been fair? I must read it now.
That's right. So I will bet you that you get 80% response within 48 hours, even from superstar professor at Oxford or Cambridge or Stanford or Tsinghua, wherever you want to go, you'll get an answer, okay? Because that message really taps in to what even leading scientists want to know. How is someone building on my work? What do you mean they've been fair? Maybe they haven't been fair. And, leading scientists generally care about their reputation. So when I told this to the student, it was just an emerging idea. He came back to me and he was very upset. He said, I can't send these people this paper. It says, you know, the work of superstar professor failed to do X, Y, Z. This paper rectifies this glaring omission. And I could see, yeah. But, you know, that's an easy thing to fix. And it also exemplifies the kind of attitude that some people, including me, slip into, which is the competitive nature of science, okay? Rather than the collaborative, social, and community. And if you're living in a community, you want to be a good citizen, right? And so the fix is easy. You know, the pioneering work of superstar professor can be productively enhanced by the work of this paper, okay, or extended, whatever word, you know. And so it shows you there's just a way of reframing when you can go social, when you have the World Wide Web, when you have email, when you expect it to be social, when you're building a network, when you're reaching out, that's where you should be. And I want my students at Maryland, many of them are, I would say, low self-efficacy. I mean, the Oxford students have a high sense of self-efficacy and importance sometimes. But my students, there's more of a struggle. And when I tell them they should be seeing these people as people that, with respect, but they should engage with them. And that's what I expect from them. And it really does work in a very nice way. So those are the ways of promoting adoption. Assessing impacts, yet another challenge. Citation counts are a good thing, but there's many other things. Download counts, and then impact statements. The book cites a number of good sources. The Becker model of assessing impact, 16-page with 5 categories of how research can have impact on basic knowledge, on education, on clinical work, this is medical, on public policy, and entrepreneurship, you know, spin-off companies. So young people, young researchers need to catalog the ways they've had impact and be able to tell the story. And the admirable, well, maybe mostly admirable British exercise on the research assessment, evaluation framework, right, gets to those things. And many universities have stepped up, like Oxford and Cambridge, and are really good at telling stories. And so that kind of skill becomes important. I do ask my colleagues, I gave a talk at Maryland to a group of researchers, I asked for 1 hour a month to make a YouTube video, to give a talk, to interpret your work for the general audience, to speak about it somewhere, or blog. One of my colleagues, some of you may know, programming language, a guy named Michael Hicks, he took the message up and started a blog on programming language. He has 20,000 followers. It's changed his position. He's now seen as a stronger leader. He's invited to keynote. He's invited to many other activities. And it's brought him many fruitful things, as well as thinking about what's important to write about in that field. Similarly, you may know in the theory area, complexity theory, Bill Gasarch and Lance Fortnow from Georgia Tech write a world famous, this is, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, a world famous blog about theory of computing. Okay, so the goal is, you know, solutions and theories, that's the twin win I suggested. And I hope this provides a bit of a roadmap of how to get there and what are the things to do. So I'm really done here, and I invite, you know, questions and discussion. But the new ABCs of research, and Dan Tabor of Oxford University Press has copies for sale outside at a discount for this audience. So what's over there? Mark Smith's been active there. Okay, and I guess, let's see. I mean, there's things about changing the culture on campus. So I've now moved from this idea of this descriptive writing of the book. I became aware 2 years ago that if I believe this, I ought to begin to change my campus and others. And that's, of course, a bigger effort. But I want to, you know, report some beginning to have early successes. 15 universities met on January 26th of this year in Washington, D.C. at the facilities of the Association for Public and Land Grant Universities. These 27 people had warm agreement and produced a manifesto that's called HIBAR, Highly Integrative, Basic, and Responsive Research. It's a little awkward, but the high bar suggests this is a challenge to get up to. And it has a, you know, set of ways of going about it. And on May 22nd, just a few weeks ago, I did a talk for the National Academy's webinar. You can see that on the web. And June 27th, I'll be doing a workshop for this GWEAR group. I'm getting Mark Smith's streaking through. He's thinking of you. So, you know, there's a bunch of
He's multiplying.
He's dangerous. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to get to. Anyway, the closing thing is applied and basic combined, achieving breakthrough collaborations, analysis based on creativity, actively build connections, and then ask bigger questions. So that's the pitch of where to go with these things in a playful way. But I hope you'll take a look at the book. There's I hope, an evidence-based approach to or thinking in a different way to get us to make the kind of contribution. Research is important. It can change the world. It can make for a better world. And we should expect that, and we should raise the expectations for our students to deliver value during their work and after that too. Once they've had the lesson of working under your tutelage to actually produce value and make a difference, they will continue in their career to do that. And that's a positive way we can make the world a better place. Thank you. I know some people have to leave, and that's fine, but I'm glad to take questions or challenges.
We have perfect time, and we have time for a few good questions. Please introduce yourself before asking a question.
Yeah, I'm Grant Blank from the Internet Institute. I had a question about the design part of your presentation. You were emphasizing the sort of positive aspects of design and how it can enhance productivity. There's also a negative part to design that I wanted you to get your comments on. That design can also be used to enhance advertisements, put more advertisements on a page, sell more product. You can look, for example, at Microsoft's Windows 10 interface as a good example of what I might call pernicious design.
In what way?
In the sense that it has lots of ads, and it makes spaces for ads on all sorts of things. In fact, the current beta tests for the Windows 10 interface now put ads on Windows Explorer, or it's not called Windows Explorer anymore, but whatever they're calling it.
Well, Windows 10, which I'm running here, does not have ads in it.
The tiles do.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. Oh, ads for Microsoft products?
Well, yes.
I see, for their
You can also
products.
buy ads.
Yeah.
Other companies
Okay.
can buy.
I hadn't noticed, actually. It was
Okay, well,
so yes,
that works
but
for
you know, I would say all these are ethically, you're right, but so does science have ethical challenges. Science can be used for problems as well and produces difficulties, as does engineering. And there's good and bad engineering, there's good and bad science, and there's good and bad design. So I don't think it's substantially different. I would say admirably, though, the design community is much, much more upfront about the ethical issues than the other fields. There are some speakers in those fields who talk about ethics, but in design, that's kind of central part of their concern, is they're aware of the powerful impact that design can have on people's lives. And so that's it. I would say recommend wonderful recent IEEE report called Ethically Aligned Design, EAD, Ethically Aligned Design, which talks about the big data issues in data science. And it writes using wonderfully fresh language. I wrote a blog post for IEEE about this, so you can find it from that as well, in my sort of celebration of their freeing up the language, which makes it very clear that the design of technology should be to serve human needs. Okay? And remember, this goes back to echo the Apple design guidelines, which say apps, not people, no, it said people, not apps, should be in control. And it amplifies that you want to build designs that put the user at the center, not the kind of smart, intelligent, and adaptive systems which take control away, not the kind of complex systems that, like newsfeed we were talking about at Facebook, which undermine what I think are the essential design principles of comprehensibility, predictability, and controllability. Those three are the sort of foundation pillars. There are others, but I think if you work towards the design of systems that empower people, as you said earlier, and give them, you know, clarity and control, and clarify the responsibility issue. I talked at length of this last Tuesday at the British Library for the Alan Turing Institute. That video is online and has gotten a lot of attention, so I'm kind of pleased, and we'll be doing some further interviews and radio shows the next day. So yes, your concern is right, but I think it's not that design is, I would say design is aligned with those problems in more interesting ways. Yeah, Nigel?
Yeah, just to say that I remember, I recall not so many years ago, possibly 2007 or 8 or so, Fred Brooks gave a talk at the Lovelace Lecture, British Computer Society's annual lecture, and spoke of this interesting journey he had had, which is exactly the reverse, from a complete belief in the power of collaborative teams to a conviction that the genius of the individual was something that we had to promote and in some sense secure and secure more. It wasn't that the world should be full of these things, and it can't be. I mean, these analysis kind of showed that, but nevertheless that we also have to be aware, great ideas though these are, that we're not all brigaded into a particular industrial view of it.
That's interesting. I don't recall Fred being that way, and his book Design of Design, which elucidates his history of moving on design and the System 360 and other projects, is
I
quite...
just was struck by that. I mean, I guess
Well, I would say ultimately, of course, all ideas come from between your two ears. And the question is, you're going to have the individual. You want to nurture individual design. But as many people have written, individual creativity will flourish best in a context where they're connected with others, like-minded, encouraging, challenging people. Teamwork is not a quiet thing. I mean, my collaborator, Catherine Plaisant, for 30 years, we have our 105th paper published together, but it's not a quiet thing. We disagree a lot, I mean, respectfully. But when Catherine disagrees with me, I listen because I know she's got something to say. Watson and Crick. Watson wrote about Crick, in a colorful way. That it was such fun to work together. Kahneman and Tversky also. Read what they say about how much fun it was to work together. How much Kahneman felt he could not create without Tversky in the room. And Tversky felt that his ideas were just wild until Kahneman approved them. So there's these ways. There's another book. I read about 50 books and 500 articles for doing this, and one of them was The Power of Two. I'm forgetting the author, Jonathan. I know where it is. I should have it right here. Look at that. No good. I think I have the listing of my book references. No, I don't. Okay, sorry, it's not in this deck. Look at that. That's awful. Okay. Don't think it's in here. No, but the book Power of Two, Jonathan Schell, he emphasizes partnerships like Lennon and McCartney and Orville and Wilbur and others. And I think that's good, but I think that's limiting. I think the larger partnerships have a role as well. So Walter Isaacson writes compellingly about this in the Steve Jobs book about collaboration. And Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From also talks. He has a larger frame. He believes it's the network that you're in. And that's a little too large for me. So two is good, but more than two is probably very valuable of different complementary. The team formation process has to do with complementary, diverse skills. So it is men and women, old and young, complementary skills, problem solver. There's a few things that go together that if you have the mix, you have a better chance to succeed. So your point, I'll have to go back to about Fred Brooks.
Well, and I guess there's other examples. I mean, again, not quite the research. My research speaks for itself, but one can think of those iconic individuals who do work in their silos, in kind of rather lonely isolation. That is their preferred mode. And one danger of the only thing to be careful about, I think, which is a great set of principles, is that we don't, in some sense, drive them to the periphery.
I agree. I agree.
Or coerce them through ref and all the rest of it to be a certain sort.
I agree. There are some people who really do want to work on their own. There are some times when I want to work on my own. And, there are phases. I tend to write kind of solitary, and writing is a pretty solitary thing. But then I'll come out of that when I'm done with a draft and send it to a half dozen colleagues for some email feedback and try it out in a talk or so on. So there may be episodes there, but certainly you make a very good point. You know that I think individual creativity we want to celebrate and ensure that it's possible. On the other hand, the sort of lonely workers who work in isolation, we have examples, and they're often celebrated by journalists and others, and the story is told of the great individual, but there's often a partnership. Even Einstein, and you know, Isaacson tells the Einstein story in very much the way his wife and others who he was, you know, constantly working with. So I think it's interesting how we tell the history, and I think, you know, these different modes are important. I hope I didn't want to exclude individual work, but I just was saying the value of collaboration. Yeah, one more? Oh, sorry, okay, thank you.
My name's Corey. I'm a student here at the Oxford Internet Institute. So there's this kind of narrative about a sort of a privatization or a proprietarization of knowledge happening in society, where you see, for example, in the newspaper, you see an article that's trying to claim that, you know, Google hires all of the best AI researchers, you know, away from universities, or there's maybe social science research happening at social networking websites and things like that it doesn't get published. And so I just wondered what your perspective on this sort of narrative would be. Is it kind of an overstated problem? Is it a serious challenge in the kind of model that you presented to us?
Well, you use the word Google hires all, so all is a little bit of a problem for me. I don't think you meant that, but there are concentrations of skill and ability, and you're right, companies sometimes will pull up Jeff Hinton and a bunch of others who went to work with Google. Sometimes that can be helpful because it brings these great minds together and they work together in productive ways. You're right, though, there may be a problem because it's concentrated. So it's an interesting question. I would say Richard Florida's book was influential to me about creative communities. And he made the point that certain cities become, attract creative leaders. And his, let's see if I get it right, it was technology, tolerance, and talent. Okay, so getting the people together, having the technology to work, and then the tolerance. So the cities that had openness to tolerance to new ideas, new ways, new lifestyles, and so on, were seen as productive. So I would say there are many places that surface, some more, the Silicon Valley legend that it's all going there. But there's lots of innovation, lots of other places. Stephen Johnson in the Where the New Ideas book, it's a brilliant book, actually, and fun reading. But he talks about the kind of barrier reef where the coral reefs flourish and the biodiversity is unusually rich. And he says there are places where concentrations happen. And so, yeah, we may see that. Is it a bad thing? You're suggesting that it's locked down, corporate and privatized. I'm sure that happens some of the time. Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. There's other dissenting views. So Gary Klein, who's written about these things and has become a friend, he has a negative view about companies. He say they inevitably discourage creativity. And I sort of say, well, actually, some companies, I think, do encourage, and there's certain. But I think there's a downside that companies can discourage creativity, and so people break away from these companies and they start their own. So it's an interesting ecology. And of course, there's a great deal of study of how do you trigger innovation. Every city in the world would like to be the next Silicon Valley, Glen, or whatever it is these days. And so how do you do that? And that's kind of, we're involved in that work as well. But Bernie, let's. Oh, I'm sorry, there was a hand. Yes, Michael, I think, right? And then Bernie, and then we'll.
Yeah, Michael Bill from UCL. Thank you for the talk. It was really, really nice. One thing I think I disagree with is maybe the title of the book, because you use research very broadly. But what you seem to present is maybe quite a product-centered view of innovation and research that's centered around some sort of design product, whereas when we think about transdisciplinary research or new kind of applied research engaging stakeholders, I often think about times when scientists are asked to basically answer unanswerable questions about how the climate is going to develop, or the effect of chemicals upon the environment, or the effect of, say, new geoengineering technologies to change our climate. And these resist the typical scientific method. They have really deep uncertainties. They're entwined very strongly with values. We can't A/B test these. We can't observe them through a process. And I don't know where you see that fitting into the framework that you present there, because I see it's obviously something that needs a lot of stakeholder engagement and needs a lot of co-creation from society, but I didn't see, when you presented that chart, it didn't resonate to me that it appealed to the kind of research that a lot of scientists are asked to do that is very, very challenging, and also of this time, 21st century challenges that you've started to
Yeah.
deal with.
Well, I spent a lot of time, there's a whole section in the opening and introduction where I talk about the terminology I use. And I did purposely choose the word research. It's not the new ABCs of science, you know. It was new ABCs of research because I felt under research we have science, engineering, and design. I was trying to lift up the design as design being a contribution to research. And by research, you're right that it favors new knowledge or discoveries, whereas innovation is not always described under research, right? I mean, those who do innovation, something else maybe. So there are, you know, I try to define science, engineering, and design. I mean, there are big overlaps, okay? And one of the criticisms I get is that the engineers think, oh, we already do design, okay? Chip design, software design, we do that. But I think you're laughing, but you know, they don't quite realize the scope of social design and other kind of things that the design community has bridged over to. And so there's a complex set of issues that are fair game here. I guess your suggestion is the word research is too narrow. Is that
Too broad. I think it
Too
covers.
broad.
I think what you're covering there is you're claiming to cover research, but you're covering a very particular subset of research, which centers around the production of products, or something that resembles a physical object.
Well,
rather
no,
than
the
some
development of
research.
new knowledge. I think of research as mainly.
With the flowchart you got, or the chart.
Okay, well, let's see. Maybe we should take it up later, but I think the twin win, I guess, under research is, you know, the theories that are typically seen as discoveries and the inventions or innovations that I put down as solutions. So I'm looking to try to get both. Maybe I failed to give that a adequate spin, but you're asking a good question. I wrestled with some of these things. Maybe you should talk to me more, send me a note, but I partition the space of science, engineering, and design. Others have challenged and say, what about humanities and art and history and sports and entertainment? Well, you know, I don't think I knew enough about those, and I sort of come from these worlds. I kept it to that scope. So, I mean, I'm all in favor of humanities as being a stimulus to creative thinking as well. So there's some real challenges here, and maybe you're right. Maybe you can write the next book or help me write that, and we'll pick it up from there. Bernie?
So I was, Bernie Hogan, the guy over there a minute ago, I'm perked up on Corey's question, and I think that using your book and what I've heard today, you probably could have gave a stronger answer here. And so I'll say that, and then I'll ask my question. The thing is, I feel like it's not just the proprietary knowledge. Oh, Facebook has a bunch of data, I can't get any more, boo-hoo, I'll deal. But it's not just that. It's that they're not producing any new theories. You know, people at that place go like, I'm being paid a lot of money to figure out somebody else's research agenda. And I'm beholden to their research agenda. I'm not getting to do any of that basic research. And then perhaps we are seeing a lot of underwhelming offerings come out of companies because they're not doing any basic theory there. I mean, Google's user interfaces, they've had a whole host of like failures in there. Google Plus, total failure. Facebook can't seem to get out of the news feed or ripping off of Snapchat. They can't seem to do it. I've yet to see a real wow innovation. So my question then is, for both academia and for industry, how do we incentivize theory?
Yeah. That's good. That's good. If you read, there's a nice 4-page article in the Communications of the ACM from 3 of the research leaders at Google called Google's Hybrid Model of Research. And they're trying to get to this, and I engaged with them, and I was critical. They take, you know, theoretician algorithm guys and put them to work on a real code, and in 6 weeks they're shipping the code and testing it out and refining it and moving it down the pathways. And I criticized them for a few reasons. First of all, they didn't emphasize design in their early days. It was all about, they talked about discovery and engineering. Engineering was their word for application or building it. But they didn't have a full thought of, and they did not have design methods. The other thing is early on they were not publishing, okay? And their response was, well, we don't publish that many papers, but we do make our source code open sometimes, okay? We don't make our data usually open, but they do. So they felt they were doing it, but they kind of got the message. And the point was, I was arguing that if they published more, their work would get better because they'd expose it to public discussion, they'd get feedback. Now, yes, there's the
They're terrified of that,
proprietary
man.
issue. They're not so terrified.
Like
Why?
Facebook, this emotional manipulation
Right,
experiment
right,
had a
right. So
great
everybody know
chilling
about
effect.
this? I mean, Facebook did this experiment of changing your attitudes positively or negatively. They got a small but statistically significant, because it was a huge number of people, where they changed the attitudes people, they could manipulate, let's say, the way people, whether they posted positive or negative posts to their Facebook feed. And they got a lot of criticism. It's a complicated story, but I do describe it in great detail.